ethnicity doesn't seem to emerge as much as region does. The head scratcher is that the gliding African American speaker is still misidentified as white a majority of the time, despite the exclusion of her fronted O. The subtraction of intonational variation does not change perceptions of her as white. Regional judgments, which you see in 10 on your handout, do seem to be tied to unglided or weak-glided pre-voiceless I. In the unmodified stimuli, ungliders are rated 3.96 and gliders 3.29. When the stimuli are monotonized, the difference is muted but still remains 394 to 351. When the segmental information is removed, the I gliders actually are judged slightly more southern than the ungliders. So 11A and 11B show the statistical significance of glide weakened I versus region. Perceptions on the OO fronters are the most interesting. For all these tests, I had been asking the listeners at the top of their form, where are you from, i.e., where do you most identify with, so that they could be sorted into two categories, listeners from the South and listeners from elsewhere. For all three tests, about 2/5 of the respondents were from outside the region, including Dennis Preston will be glad to hear, one Yooper and one person from Southern Illinois. So, I subdivided the responses so that the region and ethnicity judgments could be broken down by listener's region if needed. For O and I, listener's region didn't seem to be terribly important. But for OO, I noticed that for the unaltered stimuli, respondents' region did seem to affect the responses. If you look at 13 in the handout, the region judgment means for each category speaker and listener are broken down, with speaker's OO nucleus on the side and listener's region across the top. The means are then expressed as a value of the difference from the overall mean of 2.81, with the polarity determined by the listener's region. In both cases, listeners judge OO backers to be more like the listener's region and OO fronters less like the listener's region. A t-test in number 14 on the handout shows that OO fronting correlates with not my region. P is less than 0.04. I've encountered some methodological problems that are worth mentioning. First, it's hard to solicit judgments on a high number of speakers because it takes a long time to play the samples and allow participants to respond. I dropped from 14 speakers to 9 and then later to just 6 when it became evident that the participants' patience was running out by the time the low-pass filtered stimuli were played. I also changed the ethnicity judgment. I told them in subsequent tests that these speakers are all either white or African American, because when I left that open-ended, I got all sorts of answers, many of them somewhat smart-ass, so, including robot and all sorts of things. To reach anything even approaching what a non-linguist would recognize as statistical significance would be very difficult. One way to combat this will be to give the same test to new generations of undergrads. This does not solve all potential problems. The ends will go up, but if there's any unreliability in the stimuli, higher ends might not help. Second, the testing instrument is fraught with underlying cultural assumptions, the effect of which is not clear. Stop? One paragraph? Good. The construction of southernness, while not exclusively white, is heavily skewed in that direction. Many African Americans from the South may identify as much or more with their ethnicity as they do with this region of the country. If we ask for a southernness judgment on an African American speaker of a more urban-sounding AAE, then what would the participants really be rating? If I add vowels to the study, as I add vowels to the study, I will look for ways to tighten the methodology. So, tentative conclusions as follows: C15, O, relatively salient for ethnicity, I for region, and OO for not the speaker's region. That is, if I hear OO, I think it's somebody who's not from where I'm from. Thanks.
We have time for questions.
I'd like to ask two questions, if I could. One, you're showing that people use certain acoustic features to identify speakers with areas or ethnicity. And if you identify the main focus of your paper, the salience of these features. And so that seems to be actually understating a bit what you've done. And I'm going to accuse you of being over-modest in a second point, and that's, you say that it's possible to, your last conclusion, it's possible to empirically estimate the salience of a single feature, or the identification value, I might want to say. But haven't you done something even more important than that? I mean, suppose you had a feature that was reliably acoustically associated with a given area or ethnicity, whatever, and no one could use it effectively to identify those people, inside or outside the area. What would be the point of that?
I'm not sure. Because you'd have a situation where listeners don't necessarily... I'm reminded of an N-Wave paper. I forget the woman's name. It escapes me. An N-Wave paper about 3 years ago where this woman interviewed Southerners who had transplanted to Brooklyn at least something like 10 to 15 years before their interview. And what they had managed to do was to start gliding their I's so that they didn't sound so Southern with respect to I, but they were still lowering A like nobody's business because apparently it was less salient in New York compared to the monophonical or wide reduced I. So what you're asking is something I'll have to consider. If nobody, I suppose if a goof fronts in the forest and nobody realizes it, do we have salience? Valerie.
Well, I was just going to that. One of the things we find a lot of bad vowels is that they're not very salient in the proper region, which I think is really dumb. Because they're being done everywhere. That doesn't mean they're not sending as a marker of something, right? So I think that's one thing that what you mentioned was ethnicity and regionality.
Yeah.
Obviously, people are jumping on the bandwagon, and it's a perhaps it is a marker of national culture, some other sort of process, rather than being confusion or ethnicity, because when you might really refine it in that way. And we find it really is a marker, but front vowels like I and A do have much stronger perception of and those are things that are not capital like. So I think in some sense the way we're defining is that this is like
Yeah. And might even be a marker of youth for people in parts of the country where confronting is more recent development.
Well, that's about all the time we have for questions. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.